started back a couple weeks ago in a series that we tried to do in the summer, and now we're kind of moving towards summer. An Old Testament series, and it's on the book. If you haven't seen it in your bulletin, the book of Judges, the Old Testament book of the Judges. And we started into it because it's one of those books that if you just kind of opened your Bible and, just decide, okay, I'm going to read something, I want to see what, it's about, especially if you didn't know the Bible that well, and you just open it to it, you're going to get some shocking stuff in the book of Judges. It's going to be like front page headline shocker stuff. It's going to be stuff that you're like, wow, I can't believe people did this. And that's going to be like your first thought, but then if you really thought about it, you're like, of course I can believe people did this. They're still doing that. They're doing it in Atlanta. They're doing it in Athens. They're doing it down the road. People have not changed. Sin still will dominate the human heart anywhere. And so it may be shocking to read it in the Bible, but the Bible is just a chronicle for this. It's not advocating it. It's just showing you, okay, this is what happens. This is what these people experienced, and this is where they went wrong, and it just lays it out for you. It's just being honest. It's just being, forthright. And so when you look at the book of Judges, it picks up after the time of Moses. It picks up after the time and the death of Moses' successor. Who was who? Who was the successor of Moses? Joshua. Yeah, he became the leader after Moses. He kind of picked up the mantle. And he became quite the kind of general and the leader that the people needed at the time as they would move into the promised land that God had given them. So all the tribes were following Joshua. So they move into the promised land, and then things start, and this is what we talked a little bit about last week. Things started to unravel with the tribes. Because God told them, okay, if you're going to live in this land, this is how you do it. And this is what you need to do. And they thought, that's a nice suggestion, God. But I've got another idea. And we see one by one the different tribes very early on trusting in their own wisdom. Trusting in what they think is best. It's common sense. What God's asking you to do, that's a lot of trouble. We could just do this and it'll be just fine this way. And so, that's what we see. And, we're reminded, and we brought this up last week, we're reminded, trust in the Lord with all your heart. And lean not on your own understanding. Right? And that's exactly what every tribe did that we see chronicled in that very first chapter of Joshua. Is they're all going, that's a good idea, Lord, but we've got a better one. God gave them the keys to the promised land, and they said, thank you, we got it from here. How many people start their families that way? Lord, I thank you for giving me this spouse. Lord, I thank you for this marriage. This is the best thing. I've got it from here. And they turn. They're going to live their life and their marriage and build their family on what they think is best. And they don't show up in church anymore. And they don't read their Bible. And they're not in prayer, etc., etc., etc. And you've seen it, and maybe you've lived it. But that's the kind of things we do because we trust in our own wisdom, our own heart. So that's what we were seeing just in the very first chapter. That's one chapter. We had like 20 more, right? But they were already starting to go off track early on. Okay? And so that's where we were at last week. Now, this week when I was thinking about the sermon, I was thinking about this story about a grandmother who was cooking. Anybody have the experience or the, I guess you might go and call it a blessing, of being able to watch your grandmother cook? Yeah. Was she one of those grandmothers that didn't measure anything? She just knew it. She had a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, probably never had a recipe book, that where everything was just, written out, but she just knew it. She was good at it, too. If you had a grandmother who could really cook, you were blessed, because when she was doing her thing, it was great. So I was thinking about this story because this newlywed, she was going to cook her first big meal for her and her husband. And so she gets it all together. She's going to do this ham. She's putting this together, and setting it up. And she does what her grandmother, she always saw her mother do, which was to cut the edges off the ham before she put it in the pan to go in the oven. Well, she, lives her life, becomes the mom and does, lots of cooking. And then her little daughter grows up and she's watching. And so she's watching and learning how her mom cooks. And she says, I see you cut off the edges of the ham. Why do you do that before you put it in the pan to go in the oven? And she goes, I don't know. That's what your grandmother always did. And so one day, Grandma was actually there. And so she's making the ham, and the little girl sees it, and she says, Grandma, why do we always cut the edges off the ham before we put it in the pan to go in the oven? And Grandma looks at it kind of strange. She goes, I did that because the pan was too small. Even though we're paying attention, doesn't mean we're learning the right lesson. We can know what's going on and see it, but it doesn't mean we're learning the right lesson. And this is one of the things we're going to talk about today, is because you can read the book of Judges, and I hope you're doing that. If you haven't started yet, join us and read the book of Judges with us. But you can read that and you can get the takeaways all wrong. You can learn the wrong lessons. And you think you're learning the right lessons, but we want to address that today. And so our focus is, I want to put it on the back of your bulletin where the line is learning the right lessons. Learning the right lessons from the book of Judges. Okay? Learning the right lessons. Because you might just be like the, lady watching her mother cooking the kitchen. You see them cutting off the edge of the ham, and you think you know how to cook, and you're just going to do that, but you're really learning the wrong lesson there. But you don't know that. So we want to focus on that this morning. Learning the right lessons. Say that with me. Learning the right lessons. One more time. Learning the right lessons. Yeah. Because the book of Judges is chaotic. And you want to make sure that even though you understand the details, you're learning the right lessons. So if you have your Bibles, turn in the Old Testament to the book of Judges. To the book of Judges. Now, like I said, it's going to be shocking at times. It's going to be chaotic at times. It's going to be violent at times. And you're going to go, this is a mess. This is just, awful. But there's like a key to the whole book. And I put that on the back of your bulletin. It's one of the verses, and it shows up multiple times in the book. So here's kind of like, the key to understanding how did all this go about. And it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25 goes right near at the very end. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in what? His own eyes. Everyone. That was the norm. And so that's the kind of the key, and I'm going to keep that front and center as we go through this series, because you need to know that's kind of like the key to the whole thing. If you like, if it just gets too chaotic and too brutal at times, you're reading the stuff, just keep that in mind. Just fall back on that, because that's kind of the key for the whole thing. So Judges chapter 2 is where you want to be this morning. So get to the book of Judges already. Flip on over to chapter 2. Now, Judges chapter 2 starts to reflect on the previous events. And then it starts to add some more details. And we'll pick up with verse 10 through 12. So Judges chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. It says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So whose fault is that? Yeah. Whose fault is that? Mom and Dad? So, they're on the wrong foot already because of parents, families. And it's pretty clear. Then, verse 11, then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. In verse 13, I'll go ahead and add that one. Because they forsook him and served Baal and Ashtoreths. And so, because the family broke down, because mom and dad basically ignored their responsibility and how they should be raising the children, because they faltered, now their children are paying the price. And their children are going off in crazy directions. Imagine that. And their evil is not just confined to, in a small way. It goes all the way to the extreme of idolatry. And it says they are worshiping the Baals and the Ashtoreths. Now, Baal, you might remember this god shows up lots of times in the Old Testament because he was a god of a whole lot of that region. And so he is a god of the sun. Sometimes he's looked at that way, and sometimes he's the god of the storm. Okay? But anyways, he is the god that so many of these people groups are worshiping. And the other is the Ashtoreths. And this is a female god, a goddess. And she's sometimes represented as the goddess of fertility. She's going to make sure that your women have children. And she's going to make sure that your ground, has a great harvest. Any kind of ideas about fertility, she kind of gets, credit for it. And she's sometimes associated with other things, but that's mainly how she's thought of. And so they're running after other gods, and they're running after other goddesses. And Baal and Ashtoreth were sometimes seen as husband and wife. So, this is what they're doing. This is where they're turning. And it all comes about, and you might remember this from last week or maybe some other things you read. It all comes about because they decided, you know what, we moved into this land, and they've got all these Canaanites and all the pagan people of different cultures and stuff. And instead of doing what God told them to do, is basically saying, put them into exile, they have to leave. Instead of doing that, they're like, no, we can live with them. They can be my neighbor. They can live here. They can live there. We'll just live with them. And if they didn't live with them, they even did something even worse. They said, well, we don't have to, put them into exile. We don't have to make them leave. We can make them slaves. Because we know better than God. We'll put them to good use. We'll make them slaves. God never told them to do any of this stuff. So this is what happens. And this is the result. See, the Hebrews living amongst the Canaanites and all these other groups, the Hebrews didn't influence them. didn't cause all the Canaanites to become like Hebrews and say, praise Yahweh. It went the other direction. The Canaanites influenced the Hebrews. And the Hebrews forgot their God. The Hebrews rejected Yahweh. The Hebrews forgot the God of their fathers. See, the influence didn't go this way. The influence went that way. And then they became like Canaanites. The Canaanites didn't become like Hebrews. You see? Now, if you see that, and especially if you've read the other chapters, and you go, wow, that's how it started, and that's, the nucleus of the cause, and then we see all this brutality, and all this violence, and all this turmoil, and all this ugly stuff, and then at the end, we're in a civil war. They went into the promised land, unified brothers and tribes. We're going to enjoy the abundance of the promised land together. Look what God has given us. At the end of Judges, you're in a civil war of tribes. It's literally brother against brother. And we know a little bit about that in this country. It's already there by the end of the Judges. Torn apart. Now, here's what we do. We look at that and we go, you know what? I see all this brutality. I see all this lawlessness. I see this violence. I see these wars. I see this nation torn apart. Mama didn't raise no fool. I can read the writing on the wall. I'm going to do exactly the opposite of what these people did. They did this. I'm going to do the opposite. Because I'm looking at it and I'm reading it and I'm seeing it. And I know exactly what that leads to. And so, it seems pretty clear to me. And so we think in our minds, okay, well, we're going to do the exact opposite. And the opposite would be, well, I'm just going to separate myself. I'm going to remove myself from non-Christians. I don't really need to be around them. They don't need to be around me. And I need to just, isolate myself and only be around Christians. Because I saw what happened in Judges. And they got corrupted, and I don't want to be corrupted. And so you look at that and you go, I'm just going to live my life, and I'm going to be in a Christian community with other Christians, and as much as I can control it, I'm just going to make sure that's all the people I'm around and I'm dealing with. Now that is a great idea if you are Jew living in the ancient promised land. To just separate yourself from pagans. Right? That's a great idea. But that's not a Christian idea. Because we can read this and we can learn the wrong lesson. That's a great Jewish idea for somebody living in the promised land in this ancient time. That's a great idea. Isolate yourself. Be amongst the community of Jews. And celebrate the festivals and just, be separate. And that's a great Jewish idea. But we're not Jews. And we don't live in the ancient promised land. See, Israel was put into the promised land, right? And they're stationary, right? Every tribe had an allotment. Every, family could rely on that. They were stationary, and they were supposed to, basically live in the abundance that God would provide in the promised land. He was going to take care of them. He was going to protect them. He was going to take care of them. He was going to bless them. They were going to worship together in a stationary place, right? They built the temple, and it's stationary, and they would enjoy the festivals, and they would worship together, and they would just draw close to God. And what was supposed to happen after that came together was that it would be a lighthouse to the Gentiles. This is the kind of wording that comes out in the later chapters of Isaiah. To be a light to the Gentiles, to be a light to the nations, so that all those pagan countries that heard and knew about Israel, that they would see what was going on in Israel and go, wow, those people have so much abundance. They are so richly blessed by their God. Those people have so much peace because they don't have to worry about their enemies. Their God protects them. They have such a great place and are living in abundance. We should find out about that God. And we should go to Israel. And we should worship Yahweh. See, Israel was supposed to be a light to the nations, a lighthouse to the Gentiles, showing them, revealing the knowledge of God. But it didn't come to pass, did it? They dropped the ball again and again and again. And so God says, now, okay, no longer stationary. No longer always in one place. No longer a stationary people in a stationary land with a stationary temple. He says, my people will be different. My people will go out. They don't have to all be together at one place and one time. And the temple of my Spirit is where? Where's the temple of the Holy Spirit for the Christian? It's the person. God's presence is with the Christian. And so you're carrying, as a Christian, you're carrying God's Spirit wherever you go. And that's His idea. His people, the new covenant, not like the old, His new covenant, the people go out. They live wherever they need to. They work wherever they need to. And they go out into the world. And they build families. And they live in these communities. That's what we're called to do. Not to have a holy huddle and go, well, it's just us Christians and we're just going to make it till, Jesus comes back or we die and go to heaven, It's not like that. Not like that at all. God gave you His Spirit so that you would not be susceptible. That's why He says anybody who is a slave to sin is a slave. He says He brought you out of that. You don't have to worry about being corrupted and losing your salvation. You're relying on God's Spirit. You have Him with you. Peter addresses this in his letter. I'm going to read it to you. It's 1 Peter in the New Testament, chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. And Peter writes in verse 11, he says, "Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and strangers in the world," okay? You're a stranger to the world because you're not like the world, but you're in the world. As foreigners, strangers in the world. Dear friends, I urge you to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. So you're a stranger in the world, but you're in the world. And his caution is to stay away from sinful desires, to avoid that stuff, because you know what temptation can do. Okay? Verse 12. Live such good lives among the pagans. See? You're living among the pagans. You're in the world. That's you. You're living amongst the world. And he says, live such good lives among the pagans. that though they would accuse you of doing wrong, they would see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits. That even though they may want to try and find something to criticize and to harass you about, they can see what good you are doing. And He says, live such good lives among the pagans. He doesn't call us to isolate, doesn't call us to remove ourselves. He says, avoid sinful ways, not people. Avoid sinful ways, not sinful people. Because if you've got a job, you've been around sinful people. I don't care where you're working. If you go out into the world at all, you've been among sinful people. And this is his thing. Avoid sinful ways, not sinful people. He says, live such good lives among them. And you don't have to live like everybody else. You don't have to be bitter and angry and critical and got thin skin and going to get upset about everything. And you don't have to, be agitated about everything and get worked up about stuff and blow your top and be unforgiving. It's like, all that stuff that's an old life. We're talking about a new creation. He says, live such good lives among them. Stand out. Live such good lives among the pagans. But, the first thing I urge you as foreigners, as strangers in the world, avoid sinful ways, not sinful people. Because here's the thing. That's our purpose. That's our purpose. Because as Israel was supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, right? Stationary in the land as a light to the Gentiles. What does Jesus say? You're the light of the world. You're the light of the world, Christian. See what he's doing? A city on a hill, that city on a hill, that's Jerusalem. See, he's bringing it all back to the Old Testament image. And instead of, the promised land, it's the individual and the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's our purpose. And that's your purpose in your family. Because that's the ones you have the best influence on, because you're around them the most. That's your purpose. What's your purpose in your neighborhood? The people, that you may come in contact with on a very routine basis. That's your purpose. What about at work? This is your purpose. Your co-workers, your school, wherever you're at. This is your purpose. To live such good lives among them that even their criticisms fall away. That they would glorify God when they see Him. That's our purpose. Our purpose is to avoid sinful ways, not sinful people. Because people need the Lord. And we've got a purpose. And we've got to show them the new creation. And we got to show them the light of the world. Israel had all the knowledge of God. And it fell apart. So God put His Spirit in us. And so we can share the knowledge of God with others. And we can live out our lives as disciples. That's what I want you to remember this morning. That's what I'll put on your heart as the music plays. Avoid sinful ways, not sinful people. They need you. That's our purpose.